I recently did a commentary on the David Wood and Alex O'Connor debate, particularly on the Q&A section, because I was there and I was able to ask a question and Alex gave his response, and his argument was on whether or not Jesus pre-existed as the angel of the Lord. And he used Hebrews 1 to object to that concept. And so I did commentary on that. And so you could check out that video. And Alex actually responded. He actually had a lot to say. So we're going to break this up into parts, just like the Quran. Take a look. Hey, thanks for the question and the video, but I think your entire premise here is faulty. You say that I claimed Hebrews itself has a low Christology, denying a pre-incarnate son. Gives the timestamps. I never denied that Hebrews has a high Christology. Of course it does. The whole project of Hebrews 1 is highly exalting Christ as separate from the angels after establishing his pre-existence. The debate was about Jesus's claims, so I would not mention in that context. This makes your commentary here on Hebrews 1, while perfectly sensible, irrelevant to my case. I brought Hebrews up only to specifically discuss whether Christians should think Jesus is the angel of Yahweh in Exodus, not to imply that the text had a low Christology. You suggest that I was using Hebrews to disprove a pre-incarnate son. That would be an insane take. On the angel of Yahweh itself, your original response, Hebrews chapter 11, verse 26, remains an interesting retort, but I still don't think it confirms Jesus as the angel in Exodus. It may do. Perhaps you're right, which would be a really interesting fact, though of course still not establishing anything about Jesus's own claims. But I don't think it's conclusive. Nothing in this response video indicates Jesus is the angel in Exodus either. Shout out to Alex for giving us a thoughtful response. And I just can't wait to see him in person, because this really is an interesting topic. And it's wild for you to say, Alex, that nothing in the previous video indicates that Jesus is the angel in Exodus. That's wild, man. And here's why. I'm glad that you acknowledge that Jesus, according to Hebrews 1, pre-existed, right, as God's son, separate and exalted over the angels. I'm glad that you highlight that. But that same point is what you're missing. Who Jesus pre-existed as is the point. That's the very point. The fact that he pre-existed as the Son who reveals the Father, who makes the Father known, who created all things and created the heavens and the earth, who is unchanging, that right there shows you who he was back then, being active with the prophets, revealing himself to the prophets. For example, your point was that, God spoke to the prophets in many ways, right? But in these last days, he speaks to us through his son. However, that doesn't mean that he wasn't also speaking to the prophets through his son. It literally says this: long ago, at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the worlds. Notice how it says that God spoke at many times and in many ways to our fathers by the prophets, right? That's now, how does he speak by the prophets? You have the angel of the Lord coming to the prophets, right? You have many ways that God is speaking by the prophets to the fathers. And so this doesn't negate that one of those many ways is the son. Just like in these last days, he's spoken to us by his son. That doesn't negate that he also uses prophets as well, because literally Jesus says in Matthew 23, he says, therefore, I send you prophets and scribes. And we see in the book of Acts that prophets are around and they're being used to speak to Paul, for example, and others. Prophets are still being used, but the revelation is through the son. So it's not negating that the son was speaking back then in the book of Hebrews. Now, since we acknowledge that Jesus pre-existed according to Hebrews, Hebrews 11:26 puts Jesus in the time of Moses, where Moses feared his reproach, where Moses feared the disapproval of Christ. Well, who was there traveling with Moses? Who's the one who revealed himself to Moses? Who's the one that commanded Moses to leave Egypt? That is the angel of the Lord. If you ask Moses who he saw and who was he talking to, who was he revering, he would have said the angel of Yahweh, Yahweh himself. You ask the writer of Hebrews who Moses was in fear of, who did he receive commands from? The writer of Hebrews would say, oh, that was Jesus. Alex goes on a little further to say this. In case of interest, here are some considerations. 1, Hebrews 11 is a chapter about faith and hope in what is unseen. It opens, now faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. It goes on to say of Moses, he regarded disgrace for the sake of Christ as of greater value than the treasures of Egypt because he was looking ahead to his reward. The author here is certainly placing Jesus in the time of Moses, which makes sense in his Christology, but it is not clear exactly how or in what way. It's definitely interesting, but certainly not clear that the author thinks Jesus is the angel of Yahweh. Just as John's author has a pre-existent logos, but he does not identify it with any Old Testament messenger, neither does Hebrews, despite Jesus's pre-existence. What? It's not clear? Who else was there in the presence of Moses, who Moses was revering, receiving commands from, and told him to leave Egypt? It's Yahweh. Matter of fact, if we're specific on who it is that gave the commands to Moses in Exodus 3, this is what it says. Starting at verse 2, and the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of the bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. Then he said, do not come near, take your sandals off your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. And he said, this is the angel of the Lord being identified as God, saying, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So who was it that gave the command to Moses to leave Egypt, to take the people of Israel out of Egypt so that they may worship him? Who was it that was there that gave the commands to Moses, that freed him, that appeared to him? It was the angel of the Lord. That's the one whom Moses feared, didn't want to disgrace, didn't want to have his disapproval. Hebrews says that was Christ. It's clear as day. And just to be clear, that the writer of Hebrews is not saying that Jesus was not speaking through the prophets in verse 1. Here are some verses in Hebrews as we look. Hebrews chapter 2, verse 10 to 13. This is what it says here. For it was fitting that he, for whom and by whom all things exist, in bringing many sons to glory, should make the founder of their salvation perfect through suffering. For he who sanctifies and those who are sanctified all have one source. That is why he is not ashamed to call them brothers, saying, I will tell of your name to my brothers. In the midst of the congregation, I will sing your praises. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, behold, I and the children God has given me. So the writer of Hebrews has Jesus directly speaking, quoting the Psalms, applying it to Jesus. So Jesus speaking through the prophets in the Old Testament. Here we go again in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 5 to 8. Consequently, when Christ came into the world, he said, sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body have you prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, behold, I have come to do your will, O God, as it is written of me in the scroll of the book. When he said above, you have neither desired nor taken pleasure in sacrifices and offerings and burnt offerings and sin offerings. These are offered according to the law. So when we look at the book of Hebrews as a whole, we clearly see that they display Jesus speaking, communicating in the Old Testament before he takes on flesh. So there's no way in the world that Hebrews 1 is negating that Jesus was speaking in the Old Testament or speaking through the prophets or that God was using the Son to speak in any way. He spoke in various ways. He goes on to say this. 2, Hebrews has a tendency of taking OT concepts and applying them to Jesus, even though the Old Testament passage was not about Jesus at all. Most interesting here is Hebrews 1:8. But about the Son, he says, your throne, O God, will last forever and ever. A scepter of justice will be the scepter of your kingdom. This quotes Psalm 45, in which the title God is given human king who is getting married. A footnote in the NIV for "O God" here says here the king is addressed as God's representative, which is really interesting in the context of this debate. You say that since Hebrews quotes a psalm in which Lord is applied to Jesus, but in the psalm referred to Yahweh, Hebrews must be saying Jesus is Yahweh. By that logic, since the psalm quoted immediately prior applies God to Jesus, but in the psalm it refers to an earthly king, Hebrews is saying that Jesus is that earthly married king. That can't be right. I just have to say, if you think, Alex, that Psalm 45 is talking about just some mere earthly king, some mere human earthly king who's married, my guy, you are missing the mark here. First of all, let me show you in the indications, one, that he's not just a merely earthly king. And it's not simply that he's called God, referred to as Elohim. That's not necessarily just it, because he's not just simply God's representative. He himself is God. And let me show you why. Because in verse 11, it says this about the king, about the bride, says, let the king be enthralled by your beauty. Honor him, for he is your Lord. Now, why is this significant? This is significant because in the Hebrew, the words here for he is your Lord is Adonayik. Adonayik. Now, why is this significant? Because this happens only once. This shows up only one other place, and that is in Isaiah chapter 51, verse 22. And this phrase is used. It says, thus says Adonayik, your Lord, Yahweh, your God. This is the only time this word is used to refer to someone. Elsewhere, it's Yahweh, God, the Lord, and it's used for this king described in Psalm 45. This isn't just some mere human earthly king. This is Yahweh. Another nugget here in Psalm 45, verse 17. This is what it says here. It says, I will perpetuate your memory through all generations. Therefore, the nations will praise you forever and ever. The nations will praise you, not just Israel, but all the nations. The Gentile nations will praise this king who is Yahweh, Adonayik, who has a term referred to only for Yahweh. The nations will praise him. Why is this significant? Because one, you do not have a Davidic king where all the nations praised. You do not have a king in Israel, of all of Israel, where all the nations were subject to and all the nations praised and gave him honor. This is messianic. This is of the Messiah, which is why a lot of the rabbis interpret this as being exclusively of the Messiah. And mind you, this is written after Solomon. This is after Solomon. This ain't talking about Solomon. They ain't talking about no other king other than the messianic king, who all nations will praise, sing his praises. Does that sound familiar? Sounds like the Son of Man in Daniel 7, who is given glory and honor and kingdom, right, and majesty forever and ever. And all the nations, all peoples and tongues and languages will serve him. It's the same guy. Now, you really emphasize the fact that this king in Psalm 45 is married, as if that cancels out that it could be talking about Christ, because Christ wasn't married while he was here, right? Well, let's look at who Christ identifies himself to be, not just him, but also John the Baptist. Look at what this says here. In John chapter 3, verse 27 to 29, John the Baptist speaking says, John answered, A person cannot receive even one thing unless it has been given from him from heaven. You yourself bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. So what is John saying? John the Baptist is saying that Jesus is the bridegroom and he has the bride. He's the friend that's happy for the bridegroom. He's rejoicing for him. So Jesus is the bridegroom. Now, let's continue reading. Let's see what else it says about Jesus. This is Mark chapter 2, starting at verse 18. Says, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. So Jesus himself identifies himself as the bridegroom, just like John the Baptist says that he is the bridegroom. Let's continue this thought here. Ephesians chapter 5. Now, this is beautiful. Watch what this says here. Husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. I challenge you guys to find any verse like this in the Quran. Oh, strays. Islam catches strays. That he might sanctify her, having cleansed her by the washing of water with the word, so that he might present the church to himself in splendor, without spot or wrinkle or any such thing, that she might be holy and without blemish. In the same way, husbands should love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself, for no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as Christ does the church, because we are members of his body. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. So with Christ being the bridegroom, who's the bride of Christ? It is the church. It's the body of believers. So, of course, Psalm 45 depicts this king with splendor and majesty, who all nations will serve, who gives him a term that belongs to Yahweh alone, Adonai, and identifies him who is married, a married king. And who is the bride of Christ? It's the body of believers. The believers that, by the way, also include the Gentile nations who he saves, the Gentile nations who will come into the truth, come into his palace, and worship and serve him and the Father by the Spirit. There's no way Psalm 45 is talking about anybody else. So yes, Jesus is Yahweh, who created the heavens and the earth, who is unchanging, whose years will not end, according to Hebrews chapter 1, verses 10 to 12, quoting Psalm 102. Yes, referring to him as Lord, which would be Kyrios, referring to Yahweh in the Old Testament. And he is that righteous king who is identified as God, full of splendor and majesty, ruling with righteousness, who is married to the church, presents the church as his own bride, splendor without blemish because of his blood, who all nations will serve and sing his praises because he has saved them and has brought them into his fold, did not leave them out, did not isolate them, even though they were not originally his people. That is the Messiah. Alex continues and says, so Hebrews takes Psalm 45, which is not about Jesus, but a human at his wedding, and repurposes it for his high Christological exposition. It wouldn't surprise me if a similar thing is occurring in Hebrews 11. Number 3, Hebrews says God spoke in these last days by his son, through whom he created the world. As you state, the author clearly has a pre-existent son here, which I never denied. But that does not change the fact that the son did not speak to humanity until these last days, which remains a strange thing to say if the author thought Jesus had spoken to Moses through the burning bush. Alex, again, you are reading that into the text. It does not say that the son did not speak in the past, through the prophets. Remember, the verse says that God spoke in various ways and in many times by the prophets to our fathers. What are the various ways that God spoke by the prophets? One of those ways is through the Son, which was demonstrated in Hebrews chapter 2 and Hebrews chapter 10. It does not negate that the Son spoke in the times of old by highlighting that he's speaking in these times, just like it doesn't negate that God is speaking through prophets in these times like he did of old, which is why, again, Jesus says, I send you prophets in Matthew chapter 23, verse 36. He continues, there is, of course, more to say, but the main thing I want to emphasize is that I absolutely do not think Hebrews denies a pre-existent son, nor does it have a low Christology, nor did I ever claim as such. That's why I say in the Q&A that I have no problem saying that Hebrews has a high Christology, but clarify that I don't know about the angel of Yahweh. I wish I'd have been clearer, but I definitely didn't make the claims you said I did in your video. I also don't think you have established here that Hebrews identifies Jesus as the angel in Exodus. If there are reasons I'm missing for identifying Jesus as the angel, I'm all ears. I don't like how interesting discussions can get lost in debate formats, and this is a fascinating topic, even if peripheral to Jesus's own claims. I would like to say this, Alex, that one, I do appreciate your approach to this. The way that you are addressing these issues, I love it. You seem to be intellectually honest. You know, when an interesting point is brought to you, you have no problem acknowledging it and looking further into it, which is why, man, I thank you for clarifying that you were clear. And you're right. You did not say that Hebrews has a low Christology. You never said that. You never denied that it teaches a pre-existent son. You're just objecting to him being the angel of Yahweh of the Old Testament. And so this is why we don't use one verse to come up with a doctrine, right? Obviously, I believe that Hebrews 11 verses 25 to 26 definitely shows that Jesus is the angel of Yahweh. When it puts Jesus in Moses' time as the one who he fears disapproval of. However, I wouldn't just use that verse alone. We will look at the totality of the New Testament, the totality of the Old Testament, and come to the conclusion, look at, use proper hermeneutics to conclude that Jesus is indeed the angel of Yahweh, which is why, I'm going to be in London pretty soon, and I would love for us to have this conversation. Let's talk about whether or not Jesus is the angel of Yahweh. Does the scripture teach this? Does the scripture display and portray Jesus as the angel of Yahweh? Let's talk about it. On another note, I hope that you guys enjoyed this video. If you guys want to check out my previous video where this is all stemming from, it's down in the link below in the description. Also, like and subscribe and check out the other videos. If you guys like these type of breakdowns, let me know. Put in the comments section if you guys think good points were made. What do you guys think about the points